And so what could be a magical weekend for Sir Lewis Hamilton began with, well, being very quick on Friday morning in the one and only free practice session, and then taking the pole for the Saturday sprint race. The Silverstone crowd going berserk, as you can imagine, and Sir Lewis gracious and loving every second of it. It was close, of course, because Kimi Antonelli in the Mercedes was again blindingly quick relative to his blindingly quick teammate George Russell around Silverstone. Kimi looking absolutely fabulous in the car from the minute he turned a wheel. And it was interesting going into the final phase of sprint qualifying because, of course, that is the SQ3 is when they go from having run a set of mediums in the first and second sessions to going out for a one lap blind on a new set of Pirelli soft tyres. In brackets here, Pirelli have brought the hardest compounds in their range, not because Silverstone is particularly difficult on tyres in terms of deg or temperature or anything like that or track surface, but because there's so much load going through the tyres, so much high speed cornering, particularly of course, on the left front. Anyway, both Ferrari and Mercedes seem to be getting the best from their tyres. Lewis, particularly, again, just a shade quicker than Charles Leclerc from the beginning of practice. But the fascinating thing going into SQ3 on these soft tyres was that the wind got up again, and both Kimi and Lewis slower on the soft tyre through sector 2, the all-important sector 2, which includes Copse, Beckett's, some of the greatest corners in Grand Prix racing, slower on the soft tyre than they had been on the medium just a few minutes before when the wind was less. So it was all down to crosswind, how you were going to handle it, and who was quicker through sector 2. Sir Lewis Hamilton. Kimi Antonelli actually uses the brakes a fraction through the Beckett section, both very, very similar into Copse. Lewis feathering slightly on the throttle in 8th gear, Kimi staying in 7th. Lewis, though, coming in from a much higher speed, and maybe this was the significant difference between Lewis, well, Ferrari and the rest. I thought it was interesting how Lewis, in the one and only person they talked to after qualifying, only the winner because it's sprint, only the pole man because it's sprint, he made a point as quickly as he could of saying how much power the Red Bulls have got, how much power the Mercedes have got. And I said after Spain, it looked to me as if Ferrari have actually benefited quite a lot relative to Mercedes with the compression ratio change. And I thought it looked that way in Spain. And in Austria, the cognoscenti out there were all saying, oh no, Ferrari have got nothing like the same amount of power as Mercedes. They're really lacking power, which I didn't buy because it was very difficult actually to quantify the power around Austria of Mercedes versus Ferrari. And we come here to Silverstone where, yeah, there might be differences in aero setup, but there is absolutely no doubt at all that the Ferrari engine is very, very good around Silverstone. And a case in point is one of the critical parts of the lap, again, building up to that Copse Beckett section, going over the old start finish line by the old pits as that pit straight, which reflects to some extent, the early part of it reflects acceleration runs and traction and how well you come out of the tight infield bit there. But by the time they're in a straight line, they are more or less at terminal velocity. In the case of Lewis, still accelerating. As he goes over the start finish line there on his pole lap for the sprint, 3:22, as Kimi Antonelli goes over the same, exactly the same point on his quickest lap in SQ3, 3:11. Big difference. Now we're used to seeing big differences like that in these 2026 regs, and a lot of it is about deployment and how you manage the energy around the lap. But if the Ferrari is still lacking power compared with the Mercs and the Red Bull, what is it doing outlandishly quick? 3:22 over that old start finish line. Yeah, and it's perfect for Lewis because 3:22 and then it goes back to 3:21. It's just starting to lift and coast or clip whatever he's doing just before Copse. And in Lewis's case, he's carrying much more speed going into Copse, lifts a fraction, but he's going in unbelievably quickly and he stays in 8th gear. As I say, Kimi 7th gear for Copse. I think that was one difference. And then as they go through the first left-hander, Kimi brakes at that point, just touches the brakes, which he wasn't doing on the mediums when the wind was less in the previous session. Now, Kimi makes up for that with not coming out of the power thereafter, really, for the rest of the Beckett section. And as they hit the next corner, there's not a lot between the two, but I think that's where there was a bit of a difference, and that's where Kimi possibly lost the pole. Fair enough. I mean, this is the first time he's really been right on the pace in a car as quick as a Mercedes around Silverstone. And when the wind changes and when the gusts get up and there's potential crosswind in that section of Silverstone, who is it that's going to do a brilliant job? Lewis Hamilton. Just a great lap for Lewis. And that was a real driver's lap, in my opinion, because of that. And I think that was reflected also in Max Verstappen hauling the Red Bull up into P3 as well. He was absolutely mighty through that section as well. Quicker than George Russell. In sprint qualifying, it's still hard to believe that Max in the Red Bull blown away George Russell around Silverstone. Very, very impressive. But just going back to Kimi and Lewis, Lewis looks fluid. He looks great in the car. He's got a little bit of attitude here and there. Looks confident, quite capable of winning the sprint race. And the key thing now is to see what they're going to be like with fuel in the car. There wasn't a lot of time to do it because it's a sprint weekend, but in free practice earlier in the day, everybody did try to run a certain amount of fuel. Red Bull with Isaac Hadjar, who's been going very quickly all day, and Max Verstappen ran the most fuel. In other words, if you look at the amount of time they spend in the pits putting fuel in the car, twice as much time for the two Red Bulls, and it's reflected in the lap times as well. We'll get onto those in a minute. But interestingly, Ferrari stopped for about 6 minutes, and so did Mercedes. So I think they had roughly the same amount of fuel when they re-emerged on track to do a sort of 5, 6, 7 lap fuel run. And the key thing is to see on these harder Pirellis, different ambience, different track, whether Ferrari would have the same tire deg on the fuel runs that they had in Austria. Well, the news for Ferrari fans, for Lewis fans, for Charles fans is that they don't, because Charles Leclerc set his fastest lap of that run with fuel on his last lap, and Lewis was really quick on his second last lap as well. Indeed, Lewis was quickest overall with fuel, 31.8. Charles did a 32.1. Lewis also did a 32.1, 32.4. He was very consistent, very fast with fuel in the car. So it's not going to be the same as Austria in that sense. Kimi Antonelli, fastest lap, 32.6. Now, maybe Mercedes running a little bit more fuel. And it was significant, I thought, that he got 4 laps in under 133, whereas George Russell, the only real comparison you can have, obviously in the same car, stopped for the same time, presumably with the same amount of fuel, only 3 laps under that barrier. So Kimi not only has the pace over George, a little bit quicker everywhere effectively, but also more consistently quick with fuel in the car. But going back to the Ferrari thing, yeah, fuel runs looks as if, I mean, admittedly it wasn't absolutely full, but it's probably about the fuel they'll be running in the sprint race anyway. So, and Red Bull probably running more fuel than they needed to, just to get on top of it, I guess, to see where they were at. So going back to Red Bull, actually, while we're thinking about it, yeah, at that point, Max wasn't brilliantly happy with the car. He's been struggling with deployment issues, showing up on the new pit straight and accelerating onto the new pit straight, and also a lot of discussion about whether he should be holding it in 7th or 8th for Copse, or 6th or 7th, playing around with gears there. And as recently as, or as late in the day as sitting in the car after SQ1, Max was there studying his telemetry, trying to work out which gear would be better to use into Copse down the old pit straight. So there's definitely deployment issues there for Red Bull. Even though Lewis says they've got the best engine, the most power, they've got the best ICE engine potentially. But I think in terms of managing the power, and well, managing the deployment, and also obviously the electrical side of that, I don't think they're as good as Ferrari and Mercedes. And then Isaac Hadjar, though, just give Isaac a very good mention here, because he's, as I say, he was really quick all day, and he did a 33.4 with the same fuel load as Max, doing 33.6. But admittedly, Max did get a lot better in the second session, even though he was complaining of understeer. And I suspect that the Red Bull, I mean, it's beginning to look as if the Red Bull loved the high ambience of Austria, and it was a soft compound tire. Here, obviously, it wasn't cold, that's for sure. I mean, a track temperature of whatever it was, 41, ambient of 25, but it was 50 odd in Austria, of course. And it was a soft tire. Here it's the hardest tire, and it's colder, and it looks as if the Red Bull is struggling more to get the tires actually to work in this. I don't think that's the case with Ferrari, Mercedes, probably also the case for McLaren. And while I'm on about that, Max not only quicker than George, but quicker obviously than both the McLarens as well, which was, doesn't say much about McLaren, does it? Got to say though, McLaren got this livery, white, the green stripe, basic livery, going back to Bruce's 1966 Monaco Grand Prix, the first time he ever raced the McLaren Formula One car at that stage with the unwieldy, thirsty, and unreliable Serenissima 3-litre engine in the back, which was quickly swapped for a heavy Ford V8 for the British Grand Prix. But for that race, that debut race with the Formula One car, he commissioned the wonderful motor racing artist Michael Turner, very good friend of Bruce's, to come up with a livery and a colour scheme. And Michael came up with that white with a green stripe, which was then quickly changed to blue because John Frankenheimer was filming Grand Prix at Monaco in '66 and wanted the car to have a blue stripe. Pete Aaron was going to drive it, James Garner. So the green didn't last long, but it's nice to see McLaren with that detail and having the green stripe. I just wanted to say that. Now comparing Lewis with Charles, yeah, sector 2, definitely Lewis quicker through sector 2, just a little bit here, a few kilometers here, a few kilometers there than Charles. In the morning, Charles was braking where Lewis wasn't, and Charles looking like he's doing the right thing, which is just sort of slowly getting into the feel of how to drive a little bit more like Lewis, how to keep things a little bit straighter when he's braking, and looking pretty good in the car, not doing anything too spiky, as distinct from the first phase of Spain or what we saw in Austria. So he's getting quicker all the time, I think. But Lewis, again, just got to be so happy and so delighted, not only to be on the pole, but again, to be quicker than Charles Leclerc, who is, as we know, super quick. So Max P3, Charles P4, did a 28.7 compared with Lewis's 28.3. I mean, it's a big gap, isn't it, around Silverstone in the same car. George Russell, 28.7. Kimi Antonelli, 28.3, exactly the same. George just, what can I say? Just look, longer corners and a little bit spikier, which he's looked all year compared with Kimi Antonelli. And I thought around Silverstone, that difference would be overwhelmed by the George Russell effect at Silverstone and how quick he is at Silverstone. But Kimi, as kind of predicted, square to the road, soft touch, early turn in on all the slow corners, very good now on the fast corners. I mean, a year ago, if you'd said that Kimi Antonelli was going to be that quick through sector 2, that good through sector 2 at Silverstone, you would have said, nah, it's just, sorry, go away, mate, you've lost your mind. But he was very impressive. Lando Norris is actually the quicker of the two McLaren drivers in the end, but an unimpressive day for them. They will probably say, oh, well, that's where we expected to be. We're making progress, but, you know, Mercedes engines, sorry, no excuse, 28.7, not good. Isaac Hadjar, 28.8, very good. And then the two Racing Bulls, Liam Lawson ahead of Arvid Lindblad, both of whom scraped in at the back end of, nicely run, SQ2 on the medium tyres. They out of tyres, they left their runs right till the end, got both cars in. Notably, I mean, it was interesting, the teams that didn't get through, it was all by team, which shows, it's kind of sad, isn't it, really? You know, it's like it's become very scientific. Not at the front. I think the difference between Lewis and Kimi was very much athletic, very much driver. But if you look at it in SQ1, both Aston Martins out, both Cadillacs out, both Haas out, SQ2, both Williams out, both Alpines out, both Audis out. So yeah, 2x2. So sprint race, quite looking forward to it actually. Kimi Antonelli versus Lewis. I mean, I can see Lewis making a good start and just winning this one, and Kimi being second, so long as he's got George behind him. Not that he'll be thinking much about the championship, but he'll be quite, I don't think he'll be happy, and I'm sure he'll try and take the race to Lewis if there's an opening, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's how it works out. And yeah, there'll be a George Russell having a go at Max. There'll be a Charles Leclerc having a go at Max, and there'll be maybe a McLaren or two. But Max, that'll be the race actually, to see how Max defends P3 and whether Red Bull can give him the sort of deployment that doesn't leave him in a quandary as to what gear to go into Copse with, or whether to hold 8th on the old pit straight there. Those things are, it doesn't seem to be issues for anybody else, but for Red Bull, they always seem to be sort of slightly not here, not there, or was a bit of a compromise. And I guess it's just because, you know, every power unit's different on every circuit in every team. And this is the Ford, you know, Red Bull powertrain, which is very different from the others. So yeah, there we go. Good day, I thought. Very good day at Silverstone. Lots going on in the sporting world at the moment, but Formula One holding its own. And the sprint race will be worth watching. Looking forward to that. And then, of course, qualifying for the Grand Prix proper later in the day. I'll be doing the one video. And then don't forget on Sunday, live race chat during the race for members. So if you haven't joined, happy to have you sign up. Be flattered if you did. Very happy if you did. So please have a look at that. And we'll be doing another video, of course, after the race on Sunday. So big thanks, meanwhile, to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to Track Ninja, and of course to REC Watches for their support. See you tomorrow. Well, I have to confess that after watching qualifying today, I am quite confused. Quite confused because the goalposts that we've known in Formula One for so long are just changing all the time with these new regulations, these 26 regulations. I'm sure it's all down to that. But when I tell you that neither George nor Kimi on their quickest laps took eighth gear on Hanger Straight and they kept it in seventh, and that there are other anomalies like Max getting eighth after Copse, but Isaac Hadjar keeping it in seventh out of Copse, and actually none of that making any difference. I think that's the real point. You'll understand where the confusion comes from. There's no doubt that some cars were slower in a straight line than others, but bear in mind on the Hanger Straight, they are harvesting power, and they're nothing like flat out in terms of what they could do if they were not having to worry about harvesting power. So Max was slow in a straight line. He was doing about 300 kilometers an hour on average with the car just going nowhere in eighth gear, but harvesting power, I guess, because he'd reached the sort of terminal velocity barrier beyond which Red Bull didn't want to go any further. But Isaac Hadjar was doing the same thing in eighth gear at about 304 kilometers an hour. Why would that be? It just doesn't make any sense to me. And the same with George Russell. George on his quickest lap was never over 300 kilometers an hour, whereas Kimi was in the 305 region. But again, both of them were in this sort of harvesting power zone. The only thing you'd say about that, and I know it'll get even more confusing now. The only thing I'd say about that is that George didn't get his fastest lap on his last run on soft tires because his outlap, he got a lot of traffic. And so he didn't bring the tyres in well enough. So the time with which he starts the race tomorrow, his grid position was defined by his first run on soft tyres. And when he did that, the wind was in a completely different direction. It was 14 kilometers an hour. When Kimi did his lap, it was 7.98 kilometers an hour from the east. And so there was a difference. George effectively had more of a headwind on Hanger Straight. That's possibly why he was slower. Well, it probably was why he was slower. But then again, if they're not at terminal velocity, really, how does it all add up? The whole thing is completely bizarre to me. The only thing you can say is that Kimi Antonelli, and this is the reality of analysing the two laps, Kimi versus George, and how Kimi got the pole in effect, therefore, was that he was unbelievably good through the Beckett's section. He was quicker than George everywhere, through Chapel, through Beckett's, and onto Hanger Straight. Now, that didn't give him the terminal velocity advantage. That's a completely different subject. That's the subject of harvesting power. But he was really quick, and that's where he got his lap time from. Max was very quick there as well, but slower than Isaac Hadjar through all the slow bits, where normally Max is really good. Isaac was 2 or 3 kilometers an hour quicker through the twiddly bit at the first part of the lap. Wellington Straight, they're about the same, interestingly enough. And then the next section, Luffield, Isaac was 2 to 3 kilometers an hour quicker everywhere there, about the same over the old start finish line. And then from Copse through to the end of Beckett's, Max had the advantage. So, okay, he didn't have slow speed grip, I suppose is what you could say. But it's all very confusing, very confusing. And I'm not sure. I mean, Silverstone for me at the moment is a bit of a disappointment because we're seeing them, I mean, going down Hanger Straight and just backing off the power as they were. It was so hard to listen to. I know they've got to harvest more power in qualifying and therefore it's more pronounced. And I suppose on the general world feed TV, they didn't show too much of that. But if you're watching the onboards, whether it be the Ferraris, the Mercedes, the Red Bulls, the second half of Hanger Straight is just like, ugh. And it's the same after the start finish line as they go through turn one, turn two, turn three. It looks as if they're almost going backwards. They're going so slowly. They're doing about 160, 170 kilometers an hour, but the car's just going nowhere. It's just the revs are just staying still and it's it's been more pronounced today than it has been in the last 3 or 4 races. I suppose in a way that's to be expected because of the nature of Silverstone compared with, say, Austria, very short lap, Monaco, energy rich, Barcelona, nice compromise, but Silverstone, it really showed these 26 regs again. And I think that's why I'm confused. And I hope I speak for a lot of other observers out there. I say hope because if it's just me, then I've got a problem. I don't really understand what was going on today. Not much of it made sense to me. So let's just go through it in a fairly clinical, linear way. Kimi Antonelli, very good start to the day by filtering into second place behind Lewis at the sprint race start and pushing him a bit, getting the tyres to go off a little bit more on the Ferrari, which surprised me a bit because it did look good, as I said, on Friday on the fuel runs. But then again, the Mercedes is a great car in terms of efficient downforce, by which I mean downforce for less drag. And they've really got a big advantage, as we've suspected from the start of the year, as I've basically been saying, even though there have been moments when people have said, oh, wow, Ferrari have got it now, Red Bull are back. Obviously, these are increments of improvements in those teams, but they're nowhere near the Mercedes at the moment. No one's near the Mercedes. And just as a reference point, bear in mind McLaren, who are not a bad team, and they're pretty good at building good cars. Last year with Mercedes customer engines, as we know, phenomenally quick. Okay, maybe the car this year isn't as good, but hurt the compression ratio as they have on the Mercedes. And look what's happened to the McLaren. Basically, ever since the compression ratio rule's been recast, McLaren have been off the pace because they no longer have any sort of power advantage. And it's showing up, obviously, the lack of efficient downforce on the car, never more so than at Silverstone. Anyway, Ferrari were very quick in the early phase of the sprint race with Lewis Hamilton, but then Kimi got him and pulled away. And it was a great win for Kimi Antonelli, again, putting a stake in the ground at the circuit, which by rights should belong to George Russell. He's in the factory Mercedes. It's the British Grand Prix. He's just won the Austrian Grand Prix. You know, there's a lot of things there that come under the heading of this should be a George Russell weekend, but there's Kimi doing that in the sprint. Just a fabulous drive by Kimi, and then going out and getting the pole. Full of confidence, obviously, but not an easy thing when it's gusty, the wind direction is changing quite dramatically. And I thought it was quite significant. I hope it was significant, maybe not, that Kimi held it in seventh gear the entire length of the Wellington straight, which is the first long straight of the lap, gets eighth out of the Luffield section on the old pit straight, and then seventh is the tallest gear he was in for the rest of the lap, kept it in seventh all the way through Hanger Straight. So the big difference between Kimi and George was Kimi keeping in seventh on the Wellington Straight and George getting eighth on the Wellington Straight. I'll get on to George in a minute. So Lewis drove a very good race to finish second in the sprint. Would have been disappointed by that, of course, but nonetheless, a good result for him. But also by the same token, slightly worrying for Lewis in terms of his position at Ferrari and what he wants to do, which is always be quicker than Charles Leclerc. Charles pretty good towards the end of the sprint race. And as I said yesterday, starting to look as if he's working out how to drive the car in a clinical way, like in a clinical fashion in order to get the harvesting and the deployment that he needs without compromising too much the way he likes to drive the car. And he's starting to find that balance. As I said in a live stream, he surely will. And that balance is keeping his softness of touch and the very light feel he has for the car, but at the same time extending the braking area a little bit, just giving a little bit more straight line braking area. In terms of line, he and Lewis today, to my eye, almost interchangeable. I think Charles was a little bit earlier turn in on the last section of the lap, the old club corner, that left-right section, which is an important part, obviously, because you're accelerating out of that slow section onto the pit straight. Charles, I think, was a little bit earlier there and made it work. Everywhere else, he was basically doing what Lewis does, but just doing it with a slightly lighter touch, and he was quicker. Significantly quicker throughout the Beckett's complex, quicker into Copse as well, using the same gearing as Lewis. But he just got Lewis for the first time in a while. He was quicker than Lewis, and that will be massive confidence boost for Charles. And again, slightly disappointing for Lewis. Having said that, Lewis qualified third, both Ferraris, again, very quick, a little bit like Austria. We'll see how they go tomorrow. But Lewis on the clean side of the grid, he won't be completely unhappy with that. And if nothing else, he'll be racing Charles very strongly tomorrow, even if Kimi disappears. So, yeah, that that kind of made sense, I guess. But then P4 George Russell, which is a mystery really, because George is really struggling around Silverstone. Q1, he went off at the end of the Wellington Straight. There's that lovely increasing radius left-hander, followed by the sort of horseshoe right-hander. And that right-hander, quite clearly, you can either V that and you just extend the braking area and brake down to a point, slow minimum speed, then you accelerate out in a straight line, or you do what Max and Charles and Isaac Hadjar do, which is you make that right-hander a little bit more of a you veered a little bit, but not much, and you turn in a lot earlier than say a George Russell would. And I thought, and Kimi Antonelli, you have to put into that group as well. And I thought it was kind of interesting. That's where George went straight on. And luckily, there's a lot of runoff area there. And the car came to rest, full lock understeer, going through the gravel trap without hitting anything. He's able to get back to the pits. Very lucky. I mean, how many circuits in the world over the last 30 years would he have never got out of that situation in one piece? Well, the car in one piece. But anyway, he did get out, and that was okay. But I think, I mean, all the replays and all the talk is about, and indeed George's talk was, that's very unusual. I've never locked an inside front going into that corner before throughout my career. But my point is that the reason I think he went off there is because of how late he turned into the left-hander, and he had the car very loaded up with a wide late turn into that left, much later than Kimi. That was a marked contrast point on the laps of the two drivers throughout the day. And because he's got a wider approach, he's carrying more lateral load from the exit of the corner to the straight line position. And as he then braked, the car had load on it that it wouldn't normally have had if he'd used Kimi's earlier turn into the left-hander. So basically, it was a function of what he was doing to the left-hander going into the right. He was carrying load where the car, in effect, should have been straight, given how late he was braking into that right-hander. And so it was a function of that. It wasn't anything else. And I think George was missing the point when he said, wow, I've never locked up going into there. Probably what he should have said was, I've never gone in that late, that quickly into the previous left-hander. And that's why it happened. And then he was just slow on the straight as well. So even, I mean, when he went out and he recovered and he did his quick lap, as I say, at the beginning of his first run in Q3, but he was slow on the straight. And why that would be, why Max was slow on the straight compared with Hadjar. I mean, it wasn't only Max; it was George as well. So that was a really strange thing, and just a function of these 2026 regs. I find them very irritating still in many ways. I think we'd sort of been lulled into thinking, oh, everything's back to normal again, but it's not. And circuits like Silverstone really showed up, and I guess Spa will as well. So yeah, fast circuits, great circuits, make corners great again. That's what it's still all about, these 26 regs. So yeah, George Russell P4, Isaac Hadjar, very good job to be fifth, ahead of Max. Max, you could see, was getting more and more irritated as the session wore on. And as I say, a big difference really in the gears he was using in terms of the numbers you see on the telemetry. But was it a big difference? Does it make that much difference if Max gets eighth out of Copse and Isaac keeps it in seventh? You'd imagine in the old days you'd say, well, he's revving the guts out of the engine, and if for the Mercedes to be keeping seventh all the way down Hanger Straight, they're doing sort of 11-8. But does it really matter? Because all they're doing is harvesting power at that point, and maybe they're just doing a better job of harvesting power with the higher revs. Maybe it's that, but if it's that simple, why are the other teams not doing it? It's got to be something to do with the way Mercedes can carry more speed, I guess, in seventh gear, harvesting more power than the other teams would do in seventh, which comes down to aerodynamics, maybe. I don't know. Clutching at straws here, but just trying to look at some logic to what's going on. But Max, very good to watch through Beckett's again, but very irritating for him to be driving what appeared to be an on the limit lap, given all the parameters of backing off on the straight as they are, harvesting the power, and then coming out and being slow, very slow, and it's debilitating for him. The first time you watch him get out of the car in Parc Ferme, and you think, this is not good. This is, in terms of his future with Red Bull and everything else, this could be a point where Max is thinking, I want to enjoy my racing, and I'm not enjoying this. Circuit like Grand Prix Silverstone should be one of the most enjoyable moments of the year, and it's purgatory at the moment in the Red Bull. And then just to add to Max's issues, he made a terrible start again in the sprint race, as just as bad as it was as he did a practice start going onto the formation lap. Lets the clutch out, and the whole thing dies, and then eventually picks up pace. And it did exactly the same thing off the line. Max, as you may remember, qualified P3 yesterday for the sprint, and he was P5, P6 going into the first corner. I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous. And so that won't be, that's a very annoying thing as well. When you work that hard to get a position, and it just keeps getting blown away at the start. And there's no reason to think Red Bull will be any good off the line tomorrow either. Well, certainly Max's car anyway. I don't know what is going on with that engine. He said several times there's something wrong with the power unit, something wrong with the engine. And that's a great shame. It's a great shame. Yeah, the sprint race, otherwise, it was a good race. It was a good race. The sprint race, otherwise, once you got past Kimi and then Lewis, it was a good race for P3, and Lando Norris drove very well on this occasion. Got up to P2 right at the start, and there's a bit of a race there with Kimi. Kimi blasted past and then eventually passed Lewis, as I say. And then Lando settled back and to finish a very good third. Max was up there for the first couple of laps, but very quickly the tyres went off. Oddly, I can't work out how this happened either, looking at the numbers, but both Red Bulls started on scrub mediums, the sprint race. Everybody else was on new mediums. Didn't seem to make a lot of difference to the Red Bulls in the early laps, but it certainly seemed to make a lot of difference when the heat cycle kicked in and their tires went off exponentially quickly. Maybe because they were used, maybe because that's the state of the Red Bull at the moment. Difficult to tell on that side. And so the only other element of interest I thought was Franco Colapinto going off massively in Beckett's in Q1 in the Alpine. The Alpine, not a great car around here, like McLaren, pretty exposed now that the compression ratio things settled in for the customer teams. Not as bad. They're not as, I mean, obviously they're worse than McLaren. Pierre Gasly had a few moments, and obviously Franco Colapinto does ask a lot of the car with his very wide approach. You can see it even through Beckett's. And he said, and he lost it. It was just a massive lose in the middle of Beckett's, didn't hit anything. And he said afterwards, well, it's normally flat. Yeah, but it's being flat is one thing. When flat, keeping as much load out of the car as you can, given the way you use the steering and the pedals. Quite another if you throw the car and you're really loading it up flat. That's when, if you have a crosswind, that's when there's going to be an issue, and that's exactly what happened. And again, it's a bit like George blaming the lockup for the right-hander, when indeed the real problem was the left-hander. It's a bit like that with Colapinto, who said, oh, it's easy flat. I can understand how I lost the rear. Well, he lost the rear because even though it's easy flat, he's asking so much for the car. He's got so much more energy going through the car, lateral load. But anyway, he didn't see that, so that's that. Okay, so we'll see what happens in the race tomorrow. We've finished with the sprint, finished with qualifying. Let's see what happens in the race. Looks to be a very, very good weekend again for Kimi Antonelli. We're halfway there from his point of view. He's keeping a cool head. He's looking great in the car. With all those retro-looking mechanics around him at Mercedes wearing what appeared to be mild 7 blue Renault team kit. For those that remember the Fernando Alonso days, exactly the same blue as when Fernando was winning world championships at Renault. But actually that blue, interestingly, and I never knew this, was the little transporter, very high speed, beautiful little transporter that Mercedes used in the 55 season when Fangio and Moss were driving for them with the Streamliner and with the open wheeler Mercedes Grand Prix car. They used this beautiful little transporter, painted that shade of blue, which I never realized because most of the pictures you see of it, or the videos, are always in black and white. But sure enough, it was that blue. So that's a nice little touch from Mercedes to have that blue and make people ask, I suppose. I thought initially, what are all those people wearing retro Alonso shirts doing around there? That's why I'm wearing one now. There you go. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to Track Ninja, and of course to RAC Watchers. Take care. See you tomorrow. The 2026 Formula One cars, with their deployment, with their harvesting, with their super clipping, with their lifting and coasting, looked pretty dire around Silverstone. Certainly sounded pretty dire. On board, turns 1, 2, 3, very slow. Into Stowe, very slow. on the old pit straight, very slow. I say very slow, sounded very slow, just coming out of the power, the driver just sitting there waiting for something to happen. The great drivers not being able to do very much with their cars, great anomalies surrounding top speeds of various drivers in various cars, gearing very different from driver to driver, lap for lap. Despite all that, there were certain human elements to the British Grand Prix that surpassed the race itself, certainly will be remembered as the season progresses and potentially well after this year as well. On one hand, we had Charles Leclerc, miserable after Monaco, miserable ever since Monaco, really not finding the groove that has always enabled him to win races when he's had the right car, to be Charles Leclerc, finally rediscovering himself and winning the British Grand Prix, making amends, you could say, for that 2022 disaster at Silverstone when he was left out to dry and Carlos Sainz won in the closing stages after that safety car debarked. But it was more than that. It was Charles proving to himself that he could win, doing so in a great arena, having out-qualified Lewis Hamilton, which is quite something these days, given how quick Lewis has been in the Ferrari in recent races. So that was one end of it. At the other, we had abstract misery and depression, really, from Max Verstappen, exasperated after qualifying that the car wasn't delivering, the Red Bull, and even worse in the race. He had great moments when he was catching cars in front, when he was ahead of George Russell, when he potentially was heading for a podium finish. But then in the closing stages, 6 laps to go, he had another big shunt, thankfully again emerging unharmed, not hitting anything hard. In Austria, there was some floor damage, which was a function of the car being as difficult as it was. Here, there were lots of things going on with the car that weren't right. But on this occasion, there was a rear wing problem, and he didn't have quite the downforce he should have got when he closed the DRS. What can you say? I mean, it's one thing after another, and it shouldn't happen. He was a passenger again, but as he got out of the car and he threw the steering wheel down, put it back in place again, you got the feeling, really, for the first time, that this race, at this point of this season, by which time we know basically where Red Bull are going, it's a very, very difficult season for them. They had a spark of brilliance in Austria, but the momentum could not be sustained. We had the feeling that maybe this was going to be a watershed moment for Max and the team, and that Max might, for the first time, seriously think about taking up some of those offers that he's constantly being given, particularly, I would guess, at Mercedes, probably replacing George. Something he'll take more seriously now, for sure, after what's happened, because, as I said a while ago, judging Red Bull in one race is not fair. We need to see over a range of races whether they are starting to gather momentum and the good stuff is going to continue. Well, we saw, as I say, a blip of success in Austria, but then it fell away dramatically today at Silverstone. There was nothing about the car that Max seemed to like. The handling was inconsistent, the grip levels were low, high speed and low speed, but worst of all, the power unit response. This, we say as an aside, the power unit that is supposed to be the best in Formula One. Of course, that does refer only to the internal combustion engine, but even so, I mean, how ridiculous is that? And I guess in a way that Red Bull have been put in this position where they can't make any upgrades because of that. That's kind of symptomatic of the way it's going at Red Bull at the moment. Is it a racer's team anymore? Race ER''S. Certainly is from a Max Verstappen perspective, but higher up, as a member pointed out during the live race chat today, would a Christian Horner have allowed that situation to happen with the engine upgrades? Maybe not. And as Max signed a few autographs and jumped in a car and got driven back to the pits, there was Charles Leclerc taking the checkered flag behind the safety car to win the British Grand Prix for Ferrari. And there was Lewis Hamilton in P3, a driver that Max had raced hard with at Silverstone and potentially would have beaten to the line. It would have been close. Lewis driving a strong, typically Lewis race at Silverstone after a 5-second penalty for jumping the start by a millisecond. And P2, a lucky P2, as much as one doesn't want to believe in luck, but so much happened for George Russell to enable that P2 to happen that you got to say it was a little bit lucky. But nonetheless, George in the other Mercedes there to finish P2. I haven't mentioned Kimi Antonelli so far because he's young, he's brilliant. He won the sprint race. He was on the pole for the Grand Prix, but it all went wrong for Kimi back end of the race. I mean, it was a rather strange race for Kimi because Charles Leclerc, who had qualified second, made a brilliant start and outpowered, out-tractioned, outran Kimi into turn one to take the lead. Lewis Hamilton made a very good start too. Nothing to do with the slight movement forward, which he then stopped as the lights got to as the third light went out. And to his credit, Lewis then kept the momentum going and still made a very good start, but 5-second penalty resulted. Those two Ferraris got in front of Kimi, but Kimi did the right thing. He settled in, found his rhythm, made sure he didn't abuse the tyres on full load of fuel, found his way past Lewis Hamilton fairly comprehensively, and then sat within 3-4 seconds of Charles Leclerc, looking like he was always going to be there and he was going to be big trouble towards the end of the race. But to Ferrari's credit, they made, I thought, an excellent call for Charles Leclerc. They kept him out just long enough to prevent Kimi doing the undercut, which meant that Kimi then had to extend his stint a little bit more. And by the time he rejoined on a new set of hards, they all started on mediums, he was about 7 seconds behind Charles Leclerc. Of course, by then the edge was starting to go from Charles' tyres and the race was on, and they were telling Kimi quite calmly over the radio. Bono was telling him that he would have Charles within a couple of laps, and the implication therefore was that Kimi would take the lead and win the race. But it didn't happen. As Kimi was forging away at that gap to Charles, suddenly he felt something very weird in the left front of the car. He felt it in the Beckett section, then through Stowe, then came straight in the pits. And they put a new nose. He said there's something strange going on, something weird. They put a new nose on the car and send him straight out again. And he said almost immediately, no, that hasn't solved the problem. And by this stage, I'm guessing Mercedes probably had data from the car showing that there was a loss of downforce at the front. They must have assumed that it was a front wing. And so by now they conclude, having looked at the front wing they'd taken off the car and what was going on, that potentially it was some sort of front wheel cover that had broken, a component failure on the car. Terrible thing. We don't see that much of it in Formula One. Certainly don't see much of it at Mercedes. We see sort of mechanical, hydraulic, battery glitches. But a component failure like this, very rare, especially, as I say, at a team like Mercedes. But it happened. And what can you say? I mean, Kimi said that it was just, he couldn't turn the car. It felt like one wheel was in the air. And doing all of that, he ran off the track limits 2 or 3 times and incurred, would you believe, a 5-second penalty on top of everything else that was going on. He came in again. They ripped away the damaged wheel cover and he went out, and he was actually going quite quickly then and starting to feel that he was potentially able to do something and at least finish in the points when the safety car came out for Max Verstappen going off. And then, of course, the race did finish behind the safety car. Kimi would have got a point. He would have beaten Franco Colapinto on the road, but he got that penalty and therefore he finished way down out of the points. For George Russell, then it was a big jump in points against Kimi Antonelli, kind of making up for some of the things we've seen, but equally that's happened already. So it's going to be close. It's going to be very, very tight. The only thing you can say coming out of this from a Kimi Antonelli, George Russell, Mercedes perspective is that in George's playground, where he should have been super quick and dominant, he wasn't. Yep, he finished second. But it was Kimi Antonelli, really, who was dominant at Silverstone, who was brilliant at Silverstone. And if he's that quick at Silverstone, roll on the rest of the year from his point of view. So it's going to be an enthralling second half from that, as I say, from that Mercedes perspective. From a Ferrari perspective, on a day when Mercedes had problems, they immediately took advantage of it. And indeed, Charles Leclerc could still well have won that race had Kimi not had that problem. We don't know for sure, and it's likely that Kimi probably would have got it, but Charles would have been leading from the start. He'd been super clean. He's very good at looking after his tyres. And of course, when Kimi went out, it was victory for Charles without any sort of problem at all. They brought him in when the safety car came out for a set of softs, so he had a quick tyre to operate on if the safety car was going to come in. They did the same for Lewis. They kept George out there. That's how he got that position. He was on old mediums. He was a bit of a sitting duck for Lewis had the safety car come in, but the safety car stayed out, and that's how they finished. And I think from Charles' point of view, this was the race, as I pointed out, in Spain, the rhythm of the race for the first time enabled Charles to feel a little bit of how to get some sort of feel and touch around the carbon industry brake friction material, something he hadn't been able to do in practice and qualifying in Spain. In Austria, weird sort of circuit, didn't work as well. But again, in the race, the rhythm of the race, he wasn't too bad. But coming to Silverstone, it was exactly what Charles had been trying to achieve. It was the carbon industry brakes. It was using the Ferrari parameters for energy harvesting and energy deployment. But it was Charles retaining, which meant wider turn in, keep the car a little bit straighter under braking, just get the harvesting correct. But at the same time, for the first time, really, Charles kept his touch. And I made that point yesterday in the qualifying vid. He kept his touch. His car always looked very light around the Silverstone lap. He was not abusing the tires. The transitions from straight line to turn, even though it was a little bit later than we're accustomed to seeing with Charles, was still beautifully seamless. And that was the difference, I think, between Charles and Lewis in qualifying. Lewis a little bit more oversteery everywhere, just feeling the car, just getting on top of the car, looking like he's really enjoying it, but a little bit more drifty, if you like, with Lewis. And then on top of that, not quite as light in the change of direction through Beckett's, which is where, as I said yesterday in the video, Charles was really, really good. So so as a result of all that, Charles was leading Lewis throughout the race. Lewis, of course, then had the penalty, and he won it. What a win. What a win for Charles Leclerc. This probably feels as good as any Grand Prix victory he's ever had, given from where he's just come. And it's happened soon enough for him now really to be enjoying and looking forward to the second half of the season. As for Lewis, I thought he drove really well. There's a strange relationship he has with his new race engineer. He's got quite a strong Italian accent to his English. He speaks English very well, but there's quite a strong accent, but that's not a problem. It adds to the whole Ferrari flavor. But I thought it was kind of strange. There were two really odd things in the first phase of the race for Lewis. One was that we got the news, the graphic on screen from the FIA, from the stewards, that Lewis was going to be given a 5-second penalty for that jump start. A jump start is not the right description. As the third light went out, you just saw the Pirelli tires just move a fraction, and then boom, the lights are out and he goes. I don't think it gave him any advantage at all. But in terms of the rules and the camera not lying, they had to apply the 5-second penalty. But I thought it was very strange that they didn't tell Lewis about that. And so when he came in for his pit stop, they said, Lewis, box, 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 and you're getting a 5-second penalty for jumping the start. Now, to his credit, Lewis didn't react to that and just stayed quiet and got on with the race. But I thought that was a bit odd. I think most drivers, certainly most of the drivers I've ever worked with, would always want to know everything that's going on around them. You get the feeling that's a little bit sort of pussyfooting around Lewis and not wanting to upset him and get the best from him. I don't know whether that was a Freddie Vasseur decision, but I don't know. For me, it's better. It would be better for Lewis to have known that, and then he could start thinking about his race. Maybe taking a bit more risk somewhere. Maybe just thinking himself how he's going to drive the rest of the race if he's got that penalty. I don't know. I just found it odd that they didn't tell him. First point, and secondly, before the pit stop, about 3 laps before the pit stop, indeed, there was a very small VSC and this could only happen in England, of course, when an emerald green umbrella blew onto the runoff area up near Luffield, and they had to put that at the VSC while the marshal came over and grabbed the umbrella for the heat, not the rain, as a change in England. And while the VSC was out, they're chatting to Lewis about tyres, and he said, "Oh, I can't turn the car. I've got terrible understeer." And that was it. And then the race restarted. And then they said, "Okay, about 3 laps later, box, box, Lewis." And he immediately said, "My tyres are perfect. My tyres are perfect. I don't want to come in." But he did come in, to his credit again. I mean, what was that all about? Are we now always to think that when Lewis likes to say, a sort of Nigel Mansell-esque, "I can't turn the car, terrible understeer," and he's actually just gone set fastest lap. Is that what it's all about? I thought that was, I don't know, it was odd. It was quite fun, really, I suppose. I mean, there were lots of fun moments to the race. There was Lewis and Max after their pit stops, when it was sort of 2021 revisited, and there were lots of passes going into Copse, weird things, and some overtakes going into Stowe, with Max staying on the outside and keeping the line down to Club and all that sort of stuff. But most of it for me was like red arrows over the top of my head, because it came out of the heading of, this is all power deployment stuff. It's not real motor racing overtakes. Make corners great again. Well, that wasn't happening, I think, in this Silverstone Grand Prix because of the nature of the circuit. And on the onboards, as I say, it was just terrible how they were just sitting on this low revs. What is that all about? No wonder that I gathered there were not many onboards shown on the world feed, and understandably so, because it was not a good advertisement for Formula One. Certainly not the sound of the cars at that point. And there was so many instructions to the drivers about gears, particularly for Max when he's struggling and he's got the power's all over the place. He doesn't know what's going on, what he can expect next in terms of what the power deployment's going to do. And so there were all instructions about what gear to use here and what. Nothing was real in terms of how racing drivers normally like to race, you know, understeer, oversteer, do this, cure that. And they think of it, most of it themselves. But all this was sort of mission control. What do you think here? Mission control. What do you think there? There was a lot of that at Silverstone, which is why I'm a bit sort of jaded about those overtakes. I'm sure there'll be plenty out there on the internet, plenty of chat about Max on the outside here, Lewis on the inside at Copse, whatever. But to me, they weren't 2021 spec overtakes, that's for sure. So yeah, George Russell's race, a good race. I mean, he spent a lot of the first half of the race complaining about downshifts. Now, maybe everybody has terrible downshifts. I don't know. Max obviously has a lot of problems with the downshifts on that Red Bull as well, just to add to all the other things on the car. But second half of the race didn't look like a guy with trouble without downshifts. He was very quick and aggressive, and he probably would have got Max had Max not gone off. And they had some good battles and good races, but he was never as good for a sustained period as Kimi Antonelli. And that's what needs to be remembered about this British Grand Prix, because Kimi was just so much better in terms of square to the road, looking after the tyres, consistency, and being quick in all the right places. Yeah, I would in a million years never have imagined that Kimi Antonelli would be quicker and more consistently quick through the Beckett's Chapel complex than his teammate George Russell. But he was, and absolute credit to him. And actually, there's another thing you can say about Kimi, which we can add on to the pile of other qualities that he's developed and displayed this year and nurtured this year. And that is when all this happened with the front wing and the front wheel fairing and cover and all that stuff, when all that happened and the car was starting to be a little bit drivable again, he was learning how to drive the car, which is not an easy thing to do, of course. They kept saying, Bono kept saying, no, box the car, Kimi, box the car. You're going to get a penalty anyway. Come on, box the car for the track limits. And he just wouldn't do it. He just kept going around and I said, no, I want to see if I can get a point. I want to get the final point. And at this point, Colapinto was quite near him. And then the safety car came out and then he got the penalty. So it was all kind of moot. But that was another quality, isn't it? You know, that was brilliant. Driving just as hard and just as ferocious, just as aggressive in his nature without it showing in terms of his steering wheel inputs or his footwell inputs for 1 point as he would for 25. And that's a great quality as well from Kimi Antonelli. I'd be fascinated to know what he actually would have said behind closed doors when that race was over, because he drove it beautifully. And I think maybe they kept him out a little bit too long. They left him out long enough for him to have gone to softs for the last stint. I was a bit disappointed that they didn't, actually, because that would have been fun. But even so, he had mediums there, and he went to the medium, and it would have been enough to have been right there with Charles, and it would have been 7 laps newer than Charles, and he probably would have got him, as I say. And he did a really good job of extending that first stint and doing well. And Charles, I think that was looking back at it now, that was Charles after his stop not being quite as quick perhaps as you thought he was going to be on a new set of mediums in the race. He was at that phase of the race, that was the only place where maybe he was a little bit shallow, and that was why I think Kimi was in such good shape at the end, maybe to have won that race. So it's a bit sort of messy. The whole thing was a bit messy. The whole weekend was a bit messy because it was coloured by these absurd differences in top speed when they're all well below maximum speed anyway, when they're all harvesting. And it was coloured by all these weird gear things and none of the normal racing things. And this, to me, what do you expect? 2026 regs. This is what you're going to get on a circuit like Silverstone, which is a great shame because it's one of the great Grand Prix circuits with some great corners. And quite clearly, when the committee sat around and drew up these new regulations for 2026, they didn't have in the back of their mind Silverstone Grand Prix circuit. They were thinking of, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, I would imagine, or Vegas. They were never thinking of Silverstone and Beckett's and Copse. So, or the turn 1, 2, 3 complex either. I mean, turn 1 is usually a very good corner, but this was, give me a break. Weird weekend in a way, but a weekend ultimately that will be remembered for its human elements more than anything else. For the highs of Charles Leclerc, for the lows of Max Verstappen, and for the ongoing brilliance of that young Italian called Kimi Antonelli. Is that a bad thing? Probably not. I mean, it is ultimately about human beings at the end of the day. And that's what we saw. Human beings and racing drivers. We saw racing drivers at Silverstone, not doing what they normally do, but we saw them in another guise. And in a way, that's probably enough. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to Track Ninja, and to RSC Watchers. Take care and see you soon.